Three people were scheduled to be executed in the month of November. Richard Bernard Moore, November 1st, South Carolina. He was found guilty of killing James Mahoney, a convenience store employee in Spartanburg, South Carolina, in September 1999. Moore's case gained worldwide attention in 2022 when, in accordance with the state's new capital sentence rules, he chose to be executed by firing squad instead of being put to death by lethal injection. Moore was raised in Detroit, Michigan. He battled drug addiction and resorted to burglary as a means of funding his habit. Because of his vices, he was found guilty of theft and possession of weapons in the 1980s. He and his partner, Linda Bird, relocated from Michigan to Spartanburg in 1991. Later, the couple had 2 kids together. While attempting to steal Michelle Crowder's purse in 1991, Moore struck her in the neck. Because she landed on the purse, Moore kicked her repeatedly in the head and back. But that attack did not end there, because Moore also assaulted Crowder's fiancée so badly that he had to be taken to the hospital when he showed up to help her. Crowder would eventually testify during Moore's murder trial's sentencing phase. Valerie Wisniewski, another Spartanburg resident, said that Moore robbed her when she was employed at a shoe store. In 1997, Moore also entered a guilty plea to high and aggravated assault and battery for attacking a lady. He was a violent man, and that only escalated as time went by. Early on September 16, 1999, Moore went into the convenience store Nicky's. He planned to rob the business in order to purchase drugs, and he was unarmed. Terry Hayden, an eyewitness to the incident, and James Mahoney, a 42-year-old clerk, were inside the business. Hayden watched Moore move toward the store's cooler while he was playing video poker. Then he heard Mahoney yell at Moore and questioning his actions. Hayden looked over and saw Mahoney and Moore fighting. Mahoney pulled out a gun, but Moore managed to take it from the clerk and pointed it to Hayden, asking the witness not to move. Moore then attempted but failed to shoot Hayden. Pretending to be dead, Hayden collapsed to the ground. A few more rounds were fired after Mahoney pulled out a second firearm. Moore shot Mahoney in the chest, then Mahoney shot Moore in the arm. Moore departed the store and took off in his pickup truck after pacing around it and leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Then Hayden stood up and saw Mahoney on the floor, face down, with a gun next to his hand. Mahoney passed away from a gunshot wound to the chest a few minutes after Hayden called the police. Moore stole $1,408 from the business. While monitoring the neighborhood after Moore left the business, Deputy Bobby Rowlands, who was searching for him, heard a loud bang. About 1.5 miles from the scene of the incident, Moore had backed his pickup truck into a telephone pole. Moore was seated in the back of the truck, bleeding from the gunshot wound to his left arm when Rowlands got close to the car. Moore admitted to the crime as Rowlands yelled for him to turn himself in. The stolen cash was discovered on the truck's front seat in a blood-stained bag. Shortly before daybreak, the weapon that Moore had stolen from Mahoney was discovered on a neighboring highway. After being transported to Spartanburg Hospital, Moore received medical attention for his wounds. He was subsequently charged with murder, assault, and battery with intent to kill and armed robbery. In October 2001, Moore was put on trial. He was convicted on all counts by the jury and found guilty. The jury recommended the death penalty in a different sentencing hearing. On October 22, 2001, Moore was formally given the death penalty for Mahoney's murder. The first gun was drawn by Mahoney, and Moore said he shot him in self-defense. According to his supporters and appellate attorneys, the crime did not warrant the death punishment. Given that Moore didn't have a firearm with him, his attorneys contended that he didn't mean to kill anyone when he entered the business unarmed. He seized the gun from Mahoney, and it was circumstantial rather than intentional. One contentious element of Moore's trial was the absence of any African Americans on the jury that found him guilty. Moore was the only death row inmate in South Carolina that had such a jury. Circuit Judge Gary Carey set his execution date for January 22, 2002. But at the time, prosecutors admitted that Moore would not be put to death until after years of appeals. Another execution date for Moore was set for December 4, 2020, after he ran out of appeals. However, the state lacked the lethal injection medicines necessary to carry out his execution. Moore had the option of dying by electric chair or by lethal injection. He refused to choose any of them, thus the primary method of lethal injection had to be used to end his life. His execution was postponed because the state lacked the necessary medications. As a result, once the drugs required for lethal injection were not obtained, lawmakers in South Carolina sought to add the alternative of execution by firing squad in an effort to recommence executions. A bill offered prisoners the options of being executed by firing squad or electrocution in the event that lethal injection medications were not available. The state said in March 2022 that it had completed creating procedures for firing squad executions. The date of Moore's punishment was set for April 29, 2022. He opted to be put to death by firing squad on April 15 rather than by electric chair. The South Carolina Supreme Court temporarily stayed the execution on April 20. At the time of Moore's scheduled execution on April 29, the outcome of two lawsuits that Moore's lawyers had previously filed contested whether South Carolina's execution practices, including the use of the electric chair, were unconstitutional and whether Moore's sentence was suitable for the level of severity of the crime. The court decided on July 31, 2024, that the firing squad and electrocution methods of execution are constitutional. Another prisoner on South Carolina's death row, Freddie Eugene Owens, was set to be executed on September 20, 2024. Moore and 4 other death row inmates were supposed to be executed at a later date. A court order had been issued directing that the 5 be executed 5 weeks apart. The state's 13-year moratorium on the death penalty was ended when Owens was executed by lethal injection as planned. Moore's new death warrant, which called for his execution on November 1, 2024, was issued on October 4. He had 2 weeks to decide if he would be executed by lethal injection, firing squad, or electrocution. The state would put him to death in an electric chair if he didn't choose a method of the 3. Moore decided to be executed by lethal injection. He appealed, contesting the governor of South Carolina's exclusive authority to grant a pardon. He said that the state parole board, not the governor, should determine whether to give mercy to a death row convict, since Henry McMaster, a former prosecutor, was unable to make such a judgment impartially. A federal judge denied this, holding that the governor of South Carolina should be the only one with the authority to decide whether to give or deny death row convicts clemency. A campaign for clemency was also launched in an attempt to have Moore's death sentence commuted to life in prison. Lyndall Moore, Moore's son, requested that the governor spare his father's life, claiming that his father had changed and had never meant to kill when he was only thinking about thievery. Lyndall said that he and his siblings first learned of his father's crime when he grew older. Lyndall was just 5 years old when his father was imprisoned for the murder of James Mahoney. He recalled Moore as a typical individual who aspired to be a good father and said that Moore had a typical life in Southeast Michigan before doing drugs and getting into trouble with the law. Moore made a concerted effort to establish a strong relationship with his son. Moore had always behaved well while incarcerated and had only broken the law twice. Alexandria, Moore's daughter, who is married and has 2 kids of her own, said her father had changed his ways and that she hoped his life would be saved since he had tried to be a good influence to those he had associated with while he was on death row. Moore's last plea to hold his execution was considered by the U.S. Supreme Court on October 28, 2024. He made claims that the prosecution allegedly excluded African American potential jurors from the jury selection process, that his trial as an African American defendant was handled with a jury composed of 11 white and 1 Hispanic juror, and that this could compromise the fairness and impartiality of a capital trial. Consequently, the public's trust in the criminal justice system was weakened. Moore's execution proceeded when the U.S. Supreme Court refused to grant a stay of execution. Moore requested the governor's clemency as a last resort to avoid the death penalty. After agreeing that Moore had changed, 2 former jurors and retired Circuit Court Judge Gary Carey, who who had given Moore the death sentence back in 2001, joined forces to ask the governor for clemency. They thought he wasn't deserving of being put to death. According to former corrections director John Osmond, a strong advocate of the death penalty, Moore was one of several reliable and respected inmates on death row. And when compared to those who received life sentences for crimes more serious than his own, he was not one of the worst offenders who should have been executed. Osmond requested the commuting of Moore's death sentence to life in prison, but McMaster decided not to grant clemency. Prior to the execution, Moore's lawyer read one last statement from his client in which he thanked his children, grandchildren, and other supporters and apologized to Mahoney's family. To the family of Mr. James Mahoney, I am deeply sorry for the pain and sorrow I caused you all. To my children and granddaughters, I love you and I am so proud of you. Thank you for the joy you have brought to my life. To all of my friends, family, and friends, new and old, thank you for your love and support. At 6:02 p.m., Moore closed his eyes. At 6:04 p.m., he stopped breathing after taking short breaths. Moore was pronounced dead a minute after a doctor checked his pulse at 6:23 p.m. His final meal was a medium-cooked steak, fried catfish and shrimp, scalloped potato, green peas, broccoli with cheese, sweet potato pie, German chocolate cake, and grape juice. Carey Dale Grayson, November 21, Alabama. Vicky Dejarnette, age 37, was dropped off by a friend on I-59 close to Chattanooga, Tennessee, on the evening of February 21, 1994, so she could hitchhike to her mother's house in Louisiana. She was spotted traveling by 4 teens who had been consuming alcohol and using drugs: Carey Grayson, Kenny Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Louis Mangione. Instead of taking her to Louisiana as they had promised, they drove her to a secluded area while pretending to pick up another vehicle. When the 4 teenagers arrived to the woodland, they started drinking and hurled their beer bottles at Dejarnette as she attempted to flee. After successfully containing her and tackling her to the ground, the males began to physically abuse Dejarnette by continuously kicking her across her body. In the early hours of February 22, 1994, Grayson and one of his younger pals, Loggins, stood on Dejarnette's throat when they realized the victim was still alive. Dejarnette gurgled blood and died as a result. Following Dejarnette's murder, the 4 took her corpse and belongings in the back of a pickup truck and went to Bald Rock Mountain, where they essayed her and stole her clothing and ring before tossing her body down the cliff. In order to clean the truck and get rid of the bloodstains, the teens left the body behind and drove it to Pell City. They dumped Dejarnette's bags in the forest as well. Mangione was taken home by the 4 after they drove back to Birmingham. Grayson, Duncan, and Loggins then went back to Bald Rock Mountain, where they disfigured Dejarnette's body by stabbing and cutting it 180 times. They also amputated Dejarnette's fingers, thumbs, and a portion of her lung. After finishing the gory task, the 3 of them dozed off in the vehicle and spent the night in Birmingham. By daybreak, Grayson's girlfriend discovered her boyfriend and the other 2 still sleeping in the vehicle, covered in blood and dirt. Grayson told his girlfriend that all the blood was from a dog when she questioned him about the stains. 3 rock climbers found what was left of Dejarnette's body on February 26, 1994, 4 days after she was murdered. According to an autopsy, Dejarnette's death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head, with asphyxiation perhaps playing a role. All 4 young people were detained and accused of torturing and killing Vicky Dejarnette by April of 1994. Louis Mangione, Carey Dale Grayson, Kenneth Loggins, and Trace Duncan were tried in separate Alabama state courts between November 1995 and February 1996. Trace Duncan was the first of the 4 to be found guilty of murder on November 2, 1995, 3 days before his 18th birthday. The jury suggested that Duncan be given the death penalty. His formal sentencing date was set for January of 1996. On November 18, 1995, Louis Mangione became the second criminal to be found guilty. However, the jury recommended that Mangione be sentenced to the minimum punishment of life in prison without the possibility of parole, sparing him from the death penalty. Kenneth Loggins' trial was originally scheduled for September 1995, but it was postponed until November 27, 1995, when the psychologist failed to provide a report in time to assess Loggins' mental state at the time. After pleading not guilty by insanity, Loggins was found guilty in December of the same year, and 10 of the jury's 12 members suggested that Loggins be executed. The trial of Carey Dale Grayson, the last of the 4 defendants in the W.O. murder case, started on January 29, 1996. 4 days later, on February 2, 1996, Grayson was found guilty. 6 days later, the jury returned with the unanimous recommendation of a death sentence for Grayson after deliberating for just 15 minutes. The prosecution then attempted to have all 4 young people executed for the murder of W.O., emphasizing that the heinousness of the crime and the gore of W.O.'s demise justified the execution of all 4 lads. On March 8, 1996, a sentencing trial for the 4 defendants was planned. Circuit Judge Mike McCormick acted on the jury's recommendations in the cases of the 4 defendants on March 8, 1996. While he sentenced the other 3 accused, Grayson, Duncan, and Loggins, to death, he spared Mangione from the capital penalty and instead ordered that he be imprisoned for life without the possibility of release. Louis Mangione was 16 at the time of the murder, Kenneth Loggins and Trace Duncan were 17, and Grayson was 19. The Roper v. Simmons case was considered by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2005, and the majority decision of 5-4 formally declared that it was illegal to execute criminals who were younger than 18 at the time of their offenses. This decision affected numerous cases involving juveniles on death row, such as the 1994 W.O. murder case involving Kenneth Loggins and Trace Duncan, who were both minors at the time of the murder and were therefore eligible to request a reduction of their death sentences to life in prison. Trace Duncan's death sentence was changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole in April 2005. Kenneth Loggins' death sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole on January 28, 2006, when an Alabama state court accepted his plea. Since 2005, Loggins was the 13th young person on death row to have their sentence lowered, and he also appealed his life sentence 5 years after he was resentenced in 2011, arguing that it was unlawful to sentence children to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, his appeal was denied. Ultimately, in 2012, Alabama changed its juvenile life imprisonment laws to make it unconstitutional for minors to serve mandatory life sentences without parole. The new laws also gave judges the authority to decide whether or not to grant parole to juveniles serving life sentences, taking into account previous court decisions. Kenneth Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Louis Mangione, who were all involved in the W.O. murder, were among the numerous young people given life sentences without parole. Following a series of resentencing hearings, Mangione and Duncan were given the opportunity to be released on parole after at least 35 years, with their first parole hearings scheduled for 2029. Loggins, whose hearing was held in 2018, was not granted that option for parole. Because both Duncan and Loggins were resentenced, the only convicted person still on death row for killing Vicky W. was Carey Dale Grayson, who was 19 at the time of the murder. Grayson took his case to federal court and filed a plea of habeas corpus in the Northern District of Alabama after he had exhausted all state appeals in 2006. However, the motion was denied in September 2009. Grayson's appeal was denied by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in October 2010, and the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed his appeal and upheld his death sentence a year later. Grayson was initially set to be executed by lethal injection on April 12, 2012, but the Alabama Supreme Court delayed his execution after his attorneys filed an appeal contesting the modification of drug use in Alabama's lethal injection procedures. Grayson was one of 5 death row inmates who sued the state in 2015 to stop them from using high amounts of midazolam in lethal injection executions. Although Grayson remained on death row, Alabama law permitted the state to execute people by lethal injection or nitrogen gas inhalations as early as 2018, allowing Grayson to select either method to carry out his upcoming execution, which had not yet been scheduled. The Attorney General's office filed a motion to approve Grayson's second death warrant in June 2024, 5 months after Alabama's first nitrogen gas execution. The state representatives requested that Grayson be executed using nitrogen gas. Back in 2018, that's what he selected as a method of execution. Of course, at that time, it was very far-fetched that the state would ever employ nitrogen hypoxia to put inmates to death. On August 15, 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court approved the death warrant for Grayson, and the court order was issued for the Alabama Governor Kay Ivey to authorize his death warrant. Grayson's death sentence was set to be carried out via nitrogen hypoxia on November 21, 2024, 5 days after the Supreme Court approved his death warrant. This was about to make him the third person in Alabama to face execution by nitrogen gas, following Kenneth Eugene Smith on January 25 and Alan Eugene Miller on September 26. Citing possible issues with the new execution technique, Grayson's attorneys filed a motion to halt the scheduled execution. They pointed out that witness accounts claimed that Kenneth Eugene Smith, the first convicted murderer to be executed using this technique in Alabama, had suffered seizure-like spasms, which could be considered cruel and unusual punishment because it did not ensure Grayson would die painlessly. They also asked to amend the procedure to allow Grayson to receive a sedative before the execution. All requests were denied. At 6 p.m. on Thursday, the execution was held at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore. In his final remarks, Grayson cursed the prison warden. Grayson clenched his hands tightly, gasped deeply, shook his head violently, and pulled against his restraints as soon as the nitrogen started to flow. About 6 minutes after the gas began to flow, at 6:18 p.m., he seemed to lose consciousness. Grayson's last meal was soft tacos, beef burritos, tostada, chips, guacamole, and Mountain Dew Blast. Vicky Dejarnette's daughter Haley was just 12 years old when the murder occurred. Even if her mother's death impacted her life in more ways than one, she did not agree with Grayson's execution. Something that she said that stuck with me was how she wondered what positive impact Grayson could have had in society if the system wouldn't have failed him as a little boy that was abused and neglected. Thomas Creech, November 13, Idaho. For a second time this year, his execution was stayed. Serial killer Thomas Eugene Creech was found guilty of 2 killings in 1974 and given the death penalty in Idaho. 2 years after the appeal, the sentence was lowered to life in prison. Because of a murder he committed in 1981 while incarcerated, he was returned to Idaho's death row. Creech himself admitted to 42 murders in several states, some of which reportedly implicated the Church of Satan and Hell's Angels. Although the majority of his other confessions have not been verified, authorities think there is compelling evidence connecting Creech to 7 more murder victims, 2 of whom he was found guilty of. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department concluded in January 2024 that Creech killed Daniel Walker in what was a cold case. Creech was the state's longest-serving death row inmate as of 2024. His execution was postponed after an unsuccessful attempt on February 28, 2024. His new execution date of November 13 had been scheduled, but on November 6, a federal judge halted his execution to allow for legal challenges. He is still on death row. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye-bye.